Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is Lecture 42, the course recap. So our previous lecture was on advertising. We talked about the purposes and types. We talked about assessing the effectiveness of advertising. We talked about testing reactions. And we talked about targeting your advertising in various dimensions like demographics. And today we're just going to review the whole course at a high level. We're going to be just going over the book-related lectures, the stuff that was actually tested. We won't be talking about the content in the bonus extra credit lectures. There wouldn't be enough time. And the intent of this is to just basically create kind of like a memory repository, a thing that helps you consolidate your memories, gets you a broader narrative, something you can come back to whenever you want to try to remember, what did I learn in that class? If you just watch this video, you sort of relive the highlights, and by activating the broader subject matter of each chapter, the associations to the more detailed stuff will hopefully get activated as well. It's really good from a memory consolidation that you do review. It's also really important you do a retrieval. So a cool thing might be to, at the beginning of every one of these chapter slides, so like right here, chapter 1 slide, a good thing might be to actually pause this video and ask yourself, okay, what do I remember about principles, practices, and programs? And consider doing the same when I go to a bullet point. Oh yeah, textbook definition. Before I actually state what that definition is, maybe ask yourself, what is the definition of it? So doing those retrieval practices is really, really helpful. It's arguably, the most potent thing you can do from a neuroplasticity standpoint to really lock in those memories. So this is really the point of this lecture. There isn't a final. And test 5, the last test already happened, so that this is really for your benefit to do with it what you will. I would suggest you just periodically, I suggest you watch this now, and I would suggest that you periodically come back to it, and again, do the retrieval practice where you try to ask yourself, do I know this, before I say it, and to pause the video a lot. This is also a good video to watch like right after lecture 1, just to get a sense for what is at a course level, the stuff that this course is going to cover, to sort of prime you for concepts and to sort of maybe see the pattern of the whole class. Anyway, hope this is useful. So the textbook definition of psychology, maybe pause and ask yourself what that is. So the book says it's the application of the methods, facts, and principles of psychology to people at work. We talked about what do IO psychologists do, what is an IO psychologist, and it's really both a scientist and a practitioner. This is theory and empirical, but it's very much application centric. It's very much a triumph of experience over theory, in the sense that this is of all the domains of psychology, IO psychology is very much deep into the real world, in the workplace, providing evidence-based interventions that are actually used quite a bit in organizations around the world. One of the research areas is to focus on group processes, certainly not the only thing, but group process research is sort of centric to IO psychology. And the outcomes, really tools and techniques that are used immensely by human resources organizations, departments within organizations, and used by managers, and used by everybody when you're doing performance appraisal and going through interviews and that sort of thing. And IO psychology crosses over with multiple other disciplines too. Okay, history. And recall we had quite a few slides on this. Some of the pictures are on the right. Remember the early years, Wundt and Münsterberg and Scott, and then we got into sort of those are early pioneers of psychology, and then Taylor and Gilbreth and Follett were the early pioneers around applying science, applying sort of modern thinking to the workplace. Taylorism, scientific management, time and ocean studies of Gilbreth's, but then bringing in the human side of things with Follett. Remember World War I in testing? So doing things like, kind of like an IQ test, both for the literate and the non-literate, coming up with this notion of, okay, there's all these soldiers coming in, how do we, and we got to process them really quickly, how can we assess them to figure out what their role is? So testing was emerging as a useful thing. The Hawthorne studies, the big thing on the Hawthorne effect, arguably the most famous study within IO psychology, the thing that IO psychology has been extraordinarily impactful in the workplace. Okay, so almost anything you're using from HR, all the things we're going to be reminding you of here that we covered are all over the workplace. But within the domain of psychology, you could argue that the Hawthorne effect is probably the biggest sort of scientific contribution, at least the big obvious one to the rest of the domain. And the big thing on the Hawthorne effect, and there's a lot of things from the Hawthorne studies, we're not going to review them all here, but the big thing is, if you are doing something and now you have actually somebody looking at you and they're actually like assessing how you're doing it, somebody's research, hey, there's these researchers here, these people come in with lab coats and clipboards, and they're going to pay attention to you. Whatever it is you were doing, the task or work or whatever behavior you were doing, if now you have scientists looking at you, watching you, your behavior is not the same. So the Hawthorne effect is the sort of observer effect. I don't know. It's like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle applied to social sciences in a very loose sort of way. The Hawthorne effect's a big deal. And then remember World War II with new technology, new weapons technology that all required operators, that there was a big focus on the psychological elements, the physical elements of the human body and the human mind to make the most of this new technology, this new warfighting technology, things like the Norton gun sights, and how do you train somebody to be a bomber pilot in the shortest possible time but still be effective? And engineering psychology as a sort of explicit formal domain was really birthed during that process in World War II. And then after World War II, the post-war period, the postmodern period, the big economic expansion, behaviorism being dominant, a lot of the things that were learned in the war from an IO psychology standpoint were applied at scale to the civilian world, as well as government and school and that sort of thing, and some of the stuff that was pioneered earlier regarding advertisement really scaled up as well. And then technology and moving into all the way up to now has driven so much change in the workplace, and so it's really a moving target all the time. So IO psychology is always adapting its research, it's adapting its findings, its tools as the technology is changing how it is we work. All right, that was chapter 1. Chapter 2, techniques, tools, and tactics. We talked about IO psychology as a science. We were reminded, what is a scientific method, process of growing knowledge. It's an empirical process. It's you observe something, you make a prediction, you develop sort of a predictive framework. I mean, a prediction itself is usually based on, hey, I think I understand how these things are coming together, and that whole scientific method as this iterative, looping, improving thing. We had a little bit of a discussion about how mature as a science IO psychology is, and psychology in general. So this concept of scientific maturity, this context of physics envy, where because much of physics has very hard math predictive models that, at least within certain controlled conditions, can be extraordinarily predictive. But that humans and human culture, human interactions, human minds are so much more complex than trying to predict the trajectory of billiard balls, that you just don't have the kind of mature math models that you'd have in physics, and that presents a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, and reproducibility is a big part of that. We talked about psychological research. You observe, you want to control the situation, you want to verify it. We talked about the experimental methods. Remember, independent and dependent variables, the need for control groups. We talked about correlation, causation. We talked about directionality to causation. And we talked about reciprocality or reciprocal causality, that yes, A does cause B, but B also feeds back and causes A. We talked about statistics. Remember, the descriptive and inferential. So descriptive was, like a bell curve, histogram. Here's a graph of a population. And inferential, is based upon the sample size and making a prediction based on probability. We talked about linear regressions, and we talked about the tendency of linear regressions to mislead you if you're not careful. Don't read causality into a linear regression, and don't ignore the data behind a linear regression, because sometimes a linear regression is a very useful predictive thing, and sometimes it actually will lead you astray. We talked about meta-analyses, how you could try to combine all sorts of studies and basically say something about, to get past the complexity and the reproducibility challenges, but by aggregating multiple studies, and how the devil's really in the details of that. And remember, for causation conversation, we talked about, how ice cream sales do not cause shark attacks. That ice cream sales and shark attacks correlate, because they both happen on warm days in the beach, because people go to the beach and people get hungry for cold treats, and they tend to go in the water. And so things that are more causal is humans went to the beach on a hot summer day, and then they became hungry, and that caused them, along with lots of other factors, to go seek ice cream, and it may have caused them to want to cool off in the water, and then because of lots of other factors, they may happen to have been attacked by sharks. And so understanding causality, understanding the direction of causality, and understand what's correlation. All right, and then we got into some real IO psychology, our first sort of nuts and bolts, besides laying the groundwork around science and history and that sort of thing. We talked about job analysis, and so this was the what and the how, and we repeatedly can't come back to the what and the how of a job. So the what is, what are the tasks that you do? What are your duties? What are the activities? What are the elements of those things? And the how is, what do you need to know? How do you need to act? What are your behaviors? What are the skills and abilities you need to bring to this? What's the background? What's the context? And then, we talked about job analysis. What are the applications of it? What are the outcomes? So through job analysis and job design, you end up with a job description. You can use a job description to filter candidates for a particular role. You can use it to assess performance. To some extent, you can use it to do things like determining compensation. And we talked a lot about job performance, and we broke that again into the what and the how, the task, what is required to do the job, and how do you assess the performance of that. And these tend to be, technically defined. These tend to be objective. But then we talked about what isn't like objectively required, but boy, is it really important, and it's generally called context performance or contextual performance, and that's really the effects of your behavior, of your performance on the team and the culture as a whole. And we talked about aspects of the good and the bad here. So there's organizational citizenship behaviors, which tend to be what are your context performance things that drive better teaming. How is your behavior viewed, and how is it influencing the rest of the group? So your organizational citizenship behavior. And then on the negative side, are there behaviors you're doing that are actually counterproductive, not necessarily just to the tasks you're trying to get done, but counterproductive to the team. So OCBs and CWBs. All right, and then we got into employment testing, and this term testing is a very broad and expansive term in this context. So you have employment and selection tests. Remember, a test should be valid and it should be reliable. Valid means it's testing the thing you think it's testing, that it actually is predictive. And reliability is you can actually do this test, repeat this test, apply this test to different people, have more than one person administer the test, and you'll get similar results. And validity and reliability come up again and again in the social sciences. And the kinds of employment selection tests, they can be personality related, they can be cognitive, they can be integrity, they can be judgment, they can be looking at just what experience you have, they can be looking at your aptitudes. And interviewing is a form of a test, and that there's unstructured and structured and situational behavioral interviews. An unstructured interview is neither valid nor reliable by definition because it's not structured, it's not consistent from interview to interview. It also can get you into trouble as an organization because you don't have a consistent process, and it can set you up to being sued for discrimination. And so generally people have structured interviews, and situational behavioral type interviews are quite common. And then we talked about selection factors beyond the specifics of do you know how to do you go through the interview process, but there's also documents you might provide as a candidate. So your resume, you might have a portfolio of your work if you're an artist or a software engineer, and you have references. And then there's typically a selection process where you do the analysis, you post for a job, filter out people that are qualified, filter in people who are qualified. You do interviewing, you make decisions, make selections, check references, you bring them on board, and you onboard them. And then as a reminder around tests, so we talked in the previous chapter around linear regressions, things like cognitive ability tests and how IQ tests might linearly regress, so to speak, into a allegedly predictive line. But the scatter plot of data underneath that tells a completely different story. So, IQ as a predictor of success. If you just look at that linear line, you'd think, oh yeah, very high correlation, and the smarter you are, the better you do. But when you actually look at the scatter plot, not really. And you're really doing a big disservice, even though there might be small probabilistic differences. There are lots of people who do extraordinarily well without a high IQ, and there's plenty of people with a high IQ that don't do so well. There's lots of other factors. It doesn't mean that the factor of the cognitive ability as measured by just a thing like an IQ test or your ACT score or whatever, it doesn't mean that there isn't predictive value to that. What it means is there are lots and lots of other factors at play. So, that's a whole complexity thing, and trying to reduce the selection of a candidate down to like one type of narrow test is not very effective. All right, and then we got into employment selection some more, and the systems and the decisions that you make. We reviewed that selection process version of which I just talked about. You define your job, you make your description, you develop tests for it, you go through recruitment, you do the testing, selecting, down to interviewing and selecting, hiring, and all that stuff. And then we talked about the selection process and the law. And so we talked about the Civil Rights Act, Title VII, age discrimination, disabilities, and we talked about this notion of protected classes and reasonable accommodation, and how under certain circumstances in case law that you can have bona fide occupational qualifications, and that you can be in very narrow circumstances discriminatory in ways that might cross over a little bit with protected classes, but only if you have a bona fide occupational qualification, and that's not something you just get to decide to do. There's case law associated with all of that. If you have somebody that has a disability, you must make a reasonable accommodation. These are extraordinarily important, and they apply to much more than just whether you hire somebody or not. They apply to employment decisions, so that includes hiring, training, a performance appraisal, decisions to fire or lay off, how you classify someone in a job, even how you advertise for a particular job. And that there's disparate treatment, and that's where you're being intentionally discriminatory, and there's adverse impact where you might not be being intentionally discriminatory, but something in your system ends up being structurally discriminatory, and you're still adversely impacting things. And there's ways that's determined, like the 80% rule. All right, and then we talked about performance appraisal. Recall this, the ultimate criterion and the criterion deficiency and actual criterion and all that other stuff. But the important thing is on that Venn diagram there, those overlapping circles. The green and the yellow are what actually matters. That is what the performance that's relevant. And the red and the yellow are what you actually measure. So the red is waste. Red is driving the wrong behavior, it's wasting everybody's time, it's making bad decisions, and you want to get as much overlap between those two as possible and get that yellow, which is the stuff you're actually appraising, that actually matters. Get as much of that overlap so that most of the green becomes yellow and the red disappears. And that's extraordinarily difficult because of complexity, and because the process of appraisal inevitably has to reduce things down to something fairly simple, and the fact that whoever's doing the appraisal was not aware of every little detail of the person's performance. So it's impossible to create a system that is fully overlapping. And drawing it like this to highlight it as there's a lot of red there. That's actually to bring attention to the fact that there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of misdirection involved in this because it's very complicated. But a performance appraisal system should be part of a, fully baked in as a system. So it should be systemic. It also should be systematized. It should be time-based. And you're looking at task performance and context performance. Again, the what and the how. Performance ratings are often quantified as 1 to 5, or they have things like, meets expectations, exceeds expectations, that sort of thing. But other ratings are also common. There's other appraisal methods, things like peer appraisal. There's like 360, where it's your peers, people that might work for you, and people that you work for, all appraising you, or it could be even external, like a supplier or key partners or even customers providing feedback. And then we talked about bias and error, and there's lots of bias and error, a lot of cognitive sort of heuristic stuff that drives certain kind of thinking that can lead to errors and biases. The halo effect, recency effect, average rater phenomenon, attribution bias, and that drives the importance for training. It's essential that people are trained in how to do this to try to reduce that error, and that documentation is critical of that training, of the performance appraisal itself, to try to get things more consistent, to try to protect your organization from discrimination charges. Okay, and then chapter 7, we talked about training and development, where training is really the information you need geared for your current job, and development is information that will be helpful for your future job. Approximately $100 million is spent on formal training in the U.S., and the informal training is probably substantially higher than that. Training has to be transferred, which means it has to work, to matter. So training where nobody remembers anything is not transferred. So this concept of transfer is basically successful learning. I am trying to transfer this information to you right now. If you're learning it, it's properly being transferred. If not, we're both wasting our time. So good training is hard to do. It takes time, it takes money. And trainers must be trained. So having professional people do this is best, but that depending on what that's expensive. It's also sometimes hard to do because you might be wanting to train. Your organization might have very specific, narrow subject matter that you have to train for, and there might not be professional trainers available for that. Training is sort of a process, and so how you tee up your training, the pre-training that you do matters in the post-training. This is post-training right now. This recap lecture is really part of post-training. It's a sort of a practice thing, and so talking about training, there's on-the-job training, there's classroom environment, there's online, there's all sorts of different things. Practice. So right now we're trying to do some practice with this recap lecture. And practice matters, absolutely matters, and practice should be active. You should be engaged. You should be, trying to do retrieval. Distributed practice is typically typically more effective than massed, but you have trade-offs here in the amount of time and that sort of thing. But practice really matters. And the big thing here is, from a development standpoint, you got to own it. And owning your career development, it's really critical to your long-term success. And one of the best things you can do is just to embrace this concept of you're a lifelong learner. In a growth mindset, that your life is about growth, you're about growth, and none of this is fixed. You're always going to be learning. The world will always be changing, and just embrace that. All right, chapter 8, we talked about leadership. We described leadership as social influence in an organization, and that can be formal, it can be informal, it can be explicit, stated, everybody's aware of it. It can be implicit, which is people respond to it, but they're not necessarily consciously aware or able to describe it. And it can involve a certain amount of reality distorting, which is to say that there's a binding narrative at play, and some leaders can actually twist that, can stretch that, change that, and make people believe something else that otherwise wasn't believed. So leaders tell the story. They spread that binding narrative to establish that shared fiction for the in-group, keeps everybody aligned. They also use it to drive change when that story is updated. Now, social influence is the application of. So if you're having influence, so that means something's happening. If you're leading, that means something's happening, and you're applying social power. So what is social power? Well, social power is a thing that gives you influence. I mean, that's tautological. It's circular, but you understand it. Power can be bestowed, as in you can be appointed, and when you're exercising bestowed power, that can be legitimate, in the sense that I accept you as my commanding officer, and you gave me these orders and I just follow them. But it can also be reward based, which is, hey, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. This will really help your career if you do this extra work. It could be coercive, which is if you don't do this, it could be very bad for you. And power can be earned. So it doesn't have to be bestowed. And some of the stuff that's less explicit and less formal is often earned. But that power can be referent, which is to say, I just really admire you so much, I want to do whatever you want. It can be because you have so much information. You have the knowledge of where all things are, and it's going to help me a lot. And I'll do whatever, I'll follow your guidance because you seem to know more than other people. And kind of along those lines is expertise. Boy, you are the person that understands this domain. I don't, so tell me what to do. And then IO psychology's got a lot of theories of leadership, and we talked about them quite a bit. It's hard to really say how much of these theories of leadership within IO psychology really cross over into the other domains of psychology, and I think you'd find a lot of daylight. We're only just going to show them there and not going to dig into what they are. Leadership styles, you can be authoritarian, more democratic. It can be a sort of onesie-twosie exact instances, transactional. Your leadership style can be, we're going to transform this place. You've got a whole new binding narrative. You're really distorting reality until you make it reality. And sometimes charisma comes with that. Charismatic leadership is a thing in and of itself. All right, chapter 9, we talked about motivation, job satisfaction, and this concept of job involvement. So motivation is really goal-directed forces, acting with inside an agent. So you've got this need, right? You've got this goal-directed action. Well, what is that? Well, that's a motivation. Where's the motivation coming from? I don't know. Hard to say. So it's definitely entangled with affect. It is inherently emotional. It's inherently, this notion of a drive and urgency, or things like surgency, which is another thing. You feel the affect of that, and it's generally complex, not well understood. It can have a direction. I'm motivated to go here, to do that. It definitely can have an intensity. You can be really motivated or mildly motivated, and it can definitely have a persistence, which is to say it could be very transitory, fleeting, ebbing and flowing, or it could be just locked in and never goes away. It can be intrinsic or extrinsic. Intrinsic, of course, is something intrinsically motivating, is something that is its own reward. I want ice cream because ice cream tastes good. Extrinsic motivation is I want to get to the store so that I can get some ice cream. So I'm motivated to drive, but it isn't the drive that is sort of the reward. It's the ice cream at the end of that, so to speak. So that should make sense. And then there's what are called content and process theories of work motivation, or I could get into that, but just as a reminder, the content theories. It's kind of what needs do people have at work that's driving their behavior, and the process it's a little bit more what are the ways that what are the processes that really decision making? What are the cognitive modules? What are the things at play that you're thinking about that are driving the motivation? So just another way of framing this within IO psychology. Job satisfaction, it's linked to higher productivity, and job dissatisfaction is linked to counterproductive work behavior. That should make sense. And then this notion of job involvement is really about to what extent is your psychological identity tied to your job. So Are you somebody that says, I am a sandwich artist, and you mean that? Or do you say, I work at this other place? Your higher involvement, higher job involvement is more of a I am my job. I am an engineer. I am a doctor. I am a sandwich artist. And you'll find that job involvement, high job involvement, it's certainly going to correlate with higher levels of engagement and satisfaction and meaning and all those sorts of things. All right, chapter 10, we talked about the organization of the organization. So all organizations are structured and culture and that sort of thing. So in organizations, they have formal and they have informal structures. Within that, you've got hierarchies, and they can be formal and informal. All of these are networks. You have various processes, and you have policy. I don't really know if it's fair to say you have informal policy, but the hierarchies, networks, and processes can be formal and informal, and policy is probably really something you'd limit your definition to something that's more formally defined. You can have you have a bureaucracy, but there's also autonomy to kind of balance that out. You can kind of think of that as like I don't know, Taylorism on one side and Follett on the other. The scientific management and human relations. To some extent, that's like the what, but the how matters. And these things are balancing, and we tend to dichotomize them or make them a dialectic, which is to say to define them as oppositional. But really, these are just simple ways of trying to convey complex ideas. But an organization needs structure, but it also needs flexibility, right? It needs to be predictable. It needs to be consistent and solid, but at the same time, it needs to move and adapt and recognize that it's got complex humans running around inside it. So there's sort of a dialectic at play here. It's sort of a yin yang, sort of a chaos and order thing. Taylorism versus human relations. There's also a lot of team group processes that matter when you're looking at an organization, things like task conflict, relationship conflict. Motivation has a lot to do with the group process. Cohesion, team cohesion is a big deal. And then this notion of culture, or so organizational cultures, shared norms. This is we all have this binding narrative. We're all this part of this in-group. We have the same value system. We have the same general beliefs, which is to say we all follow the same story. We have a shared vision, and we tend to expect the same things. We share symbols and habits and other sort of in-group trappings, performative stuff, or we define ourselves as being as being the group that doesn't do X. Remember that whole, we often define our in-group as against something that's manifest easily by an out-group. Anyway, complex stuff. Organizations are multidimensional. They have culture is multidimensional here, an organizational culture. There's implicit elements of it. There's explicit. It tends to be then inevitably nested in the broader culture of the nation and the larger cultural group that the organization is in. And if you have a multinational organization, you often end up with it sort of nested in all sorts of different cultures. And those employees come from those cultures, and that adds a lot of complexity, and actually can be a source of disruption if it's not managed properly. There's this notion of person-organization fit, which is how well do you as an individual really fit to the organizational culture, and the more you don't fit, the harder it's going to be. And we talked about organizational development. It's really the study and the implementation of direct changes to the organization. We want to change the organization. We want to change its culture. We want to change its structure. And that's not easy. And the more entrenched something is, the harder it is to change it. There's a tendency to want to snap back, to regress to the mean, so to speak. You'll typically have people within an organization that fight against you. But it's critical if you want to keep an organization flexible that you're intentionally looking at ways you can make the organization better. All right, we got into working conditions with chapter 11, and we talked about environmental psychology, and that's really the study of artificial environments, built environments, workplace design. How do those things impact human behavior? That includes the layout of people. That includes things like desks and offices and meeting places. This notion of a landscaped office area. And we talked about the built environment factors, so lighting and noise and color and music and climate. We talked about how workplace conditions, that includes there's physical elements to that, and there's psychosocial elements to that, and those things can impact lots of stuff. Impact job performance and satisfaction, motivation, certainly safety, certainly stress and health. And there's many types of workplaces. You can have a work site, like a construction site. It's not going to last very long until the job is done. But you have factories, and there's lots of different types of factories. You have warehouses, you have retail, you have schools, you have offices, and other things. And there's a lot of design considerations when you're looking at a workplace. There's the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, the temperature. There's noise factors associated with that too. Lighting is huge. How you move around the building matters. What are the places that the people are? Is it cubes? Is it a big open space? Is it offices? And in under what circumstances? What are the common areas? What are the meeting rooms? What are the break rooms? Those sorts of things. What kind of accommodations do you need to make for things like people with disabilities? That sort of thing. In workplace conditions, it's more than just the physical environment. You also have to look at work schedules as a workplace condition. Where your breaks are, when your breaks are. How rest is incorporated into the job. Is how much of a factor is fatigue, and what are you doing about it? Commuting is actually a workplace condition. And then in chapter 12, we talked about safety and health issues at work. So. Obviously, workplace conditions that we were just talking about can affect work safety. And that depends on the industry. In different industries have different constraints, and you end up with different workplace conditions. That includes the hours of work, the hours that you work, includes lighting, temperature, the equipment that's around, kind of pressures applied on you to get the job done. Within redesigning workplaces for the purposes of health and safety, there's a hierarchy of controls that's used where to eliminate the source of if you have something that's unsafe. So first of all, try to eliminate it. If you can't eliminate it, try to substitute with something more safe. If you can't do that, try to put in place some physical barriers and called ways in which you can keep the person away from the unsafe condition. That's engineering controls. If you can't do that, or you've done as much as you're able to do that, then the next thing would be administrative controls. Put in rules and training and that sort of thing. And lastly, look at, okay, can you protect the person? Can you put a helmet on the person, put gloves on the person, thermal protection, what have you. But generally speaking, the importance goes from left to right. It's better to eliminate it than to better to eliminate the possibility of anything falling on your head or hitting your head than just put on a helmet. Because once you have to put personal protective equipment on, that's saying that there's dangers you haven't been able to get rid of. And then there's OSHA, a government agency, that it's really there to ensure safe work practices. And not only that those work practices are established, but they are also enforced. OSHA is an important organization, and you don't want to make them unhappy. And then there's NIOSH, and NIOSH is really also a federal organization, and that's really, they research what causes accidents and disease and what could be done to prevent it. So you could look at NIOSH as like sort of the researchers, and OSHA is the implementers, and you want to be learning from NIOSH and be compatible with things that they're doing, and you definitely want to be following the guidance of OSHA. But safety and health, the many elements that are beyond just workplace conditions, they include personal factors. So alcohol and drug use at work is a big safety and health related issue. Whether somebody has fatigue or not, all sorts of behavior stuff. There's a lot of things in how you act at work in the workplace that will affect your safety and affect your health. Accident and injury prevention, they're critical. Every organization has a safety program, has a health program. There's varying degrees of maturity of like what are called wellness programs, depending upon the organization. But everybody's got some kind of safety focus. And if they don't, you might want to consider finding a new place to work. Okay, and we talked about chapter 13, stress, and this whole notion of a stress leads to a strain, but then there's moderators between stressors and strains. So a stress, it can be a physical thing, it can be a psychological thing. It's typically a response to something that is like a strong stimulus. It's often an unpleasant stimulus. It can be a response to a threat. And that stress itself is typically placing demands, that can threaten your resources. So the stress can take away your energy, can take away your health. In a broader context, it can take away your food. I mean, if you want to talk about from a evolutionary perspective. About 2/3 of U.S. workers say that their work is a significant source of stress, and a third of the people say that work stress that they have is a chronic thing. They always have work stress. There's this subdomain called occupational health psychology that studies the health effects of stress and studies employee well-being. Now, stressors are things that lead you to feeling stress. A stressor is sort of the inputs. It can be physical. It can be just the result of you're overloaded at work. It can actually be you're underloaded at work. There can be interpersonal, your interactions with other people, that can be sources of stressors. And the strain is what happens then. Okay, you had some stress process. What was the outcome? And that can be physiological. Like you've injured your back. It can be psychological. It can result in behavior change. And then moderators of that stress-strain relationship are really important. And these can moderate in a way that's good and moderate in a way that's bad. Appraisal is very important, which is how you appraise whether a stress is causing a strain. Your personality, you as an individual, and the situational context behind that can all affect your relationship between a stress and whether it results in a strain and how much of a strain. The way you live your life, how much control is in place, how much control you feel you have over your life, how much support you have, all of those things can act as moderators. So less control you have over your life, the less support you have, the worse your lifestyle, the more prone you might be from a personality standpoint, the more likely you are to appraise things in a certain way. All of that can end up scaling up your strain and make you less resilient to stress, and vice versa. Interventions are things that try to eliminate the stressors or try to reduce the strains or try to heal if there was already strain. All right, chapter 14, we talked about engineering psychology. And that's sometimes called human factors, sometimes human engineering, or ergonomics is a term that used to be used more often. It's really the application of the scientific method to built environments in order to make the environment more optimal. And that environment can also be, a piece of equipment. So it's often around efficiency of time or efficient use and function of a tool or efficient movements. Remember Taylor and Gilbreth, typo there, they preceded this. Scientific management, certainly an engineering approach, but it was really World War II that put that on the map. And this notion of person-machine system is an important conceptualization. Often safety is a big part of engineering psychology. Whenever a person is interacting with something that's a machine, and a machine could be a car, a machine could be a factory, a machine could be your computer. Efficiency is a big deal. How much resources does it take? How long does it take? How much functions involved? Automation is sort of a part of how much function does the machine do versus the person. Workplace and tool design is a big part of that. Within person-machine systems, you look at how your workplace is designed. You look at what the tools you're using in this whole person-machine system in order to make it more efficient, in order to automate things, in order to make it safe. Displays are part of a human-machine system, and that's really any time that a machine is communicating to the human. And within a human-machine interaction, or HMI, it's when the machine is giving information to the human. That's a display. And these can be visual, they can be auditory, it can be tactile. And a control is really the other way in a human-machine interaction, in an HMI, in a person-machine system. It's whenever the human is giving information to the machine in order to make something happen. That's a control function. And control body matching matters. Control task compatibility matters. There's a thing called shape coding, which is where you can, the certain shape of a control can imply what it's supposed to do. And human factors applies to other industries. Healthcare has a lot of human factors, or engineering psychology. Just driving, lots of stuff associated with your car has had a lot of engineering psychology. Computers, the mouse, the monitor, keyboard, the UX, the user interface of all the software on your screen, are all a part of engineering psychology. Okay, and then the last chapter was consumer psychology, and we went back a little bit into history and talked about Walter Scott, and he was famous for bringing a psychological approach to advertising, and then John Watson, really founder of behaviorism, and looking at how the consumer behavior could be manipulated via conditioning, and how that affects how advertising and other things would then affect consumer behavior. A lot of research methods in consumer psychology. Those include surveys and polls and focus groups. Looking at what motivates people. Remember Ditcher and the whole cake mixes, and by just adding the egg, it actually changed people's psychological sort of relationship to the cake mix. Now they were a part of it, and they were more motivated to accept the convenience. And observation's a big part of the research methods. Consumer behavior is really what is a study, of what affects shopper behavior, what affects buying decisions, what influences motivation. And advertising we talked about, and that's just the last lecture, lecture 41. We talked about the appeal to need. We talked about endorsement. We talked about product superiority. We talked about the overall image. We talked about the importance of the packaging, and what makes advertisement effective. How do you do things like sales tests, and then targeting of specific markets. All right, that was the recap of the whole course. So hopefully this is useful to you. As a reminder, come back to this whenever. I would recommend that if you're just watching this now, having finished the course, I would recommend that before a month goes by, watch it again and put the video at 2x. If it's like, yeah, I know that. And then maybe come back in another 3 months, and then maybe come back in a year, as a way to just check yourself. And then at the beginning of each slide, ask yourself, do I remember any of this stuff? And do that recall, do that trying to remember. And it's not important whether you do or remember or not, but just by trying to remember, you're priming yourself so that when you get the information, it locks in better. So use this for that purpose, for memory consolidation. So we covered the course. So hopefully this was useful, and hopefully you enjoyed this course, and hopefully you learned a lot from it. And thank you for your participation.